Hello, everyone. I'm Contessa of WrestleZone.com, joined by Michael Kingston, the creator of Headlocked, and also Tales from the Road, the comic book that combines wrestling and comics to do a wonderful combination of the two. Michael, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Usually in the middle of Kickstarters, I'm pretty exhausted, so that holds, of course. But we're doing good.
Speaking of the Kickstarter here, I'm looking at it right now. Looks like you have passed the goal that you had initially set, but obviously you can never have too much support for the project. But how are you feeling about the Kickstarter at this point in terms of meeting maybe the numerical goal? I was listening to another interview you did where you had said something along the lines of being more concerned about getting the readers, getting the interest rather than maybe the specific number, but maybe just in a general sense. What does it mean to you to kind of have that, at least the goal that you had set out with met?
Usually at this point in the Kickstarter, right about now, is when I think about quitting comics forever. It's funny, just the nature of Kickstarter. Like your first 2 days, like you get bombarded. Like you have your proactive backers, and they're on it the first day, and then you have the people that wait till the last 2 or 3 days, and then there's this just giant chunk in the middle where it's just you're just sort of fighting for, every day is sort of a fist fight to get people and not lose people and whatever. So it's the middle is sort of very mentally taxing, emotionally taxing. So we're I'm ready for it to be done.
Obviously, it sounds very, very exhausting. But with this being the second volume of Tales from the Road, and obviously you've used Kickstarter before, like has this experience, specifically this kind of this round, been better, worse, generally different, like in comparison to the other ventures previously?
It's kind of the same, honestly. I mean, the one thing that's not good about this, I mean, this is the shortest one I've ever done. Normally, when I'm touring sort of regularly, I run them when I have shows, and then I'm able to sort of promote to people directly. And I don't have any shows for this one, which has been challenging. So I think the last one for volume one we did 45 days, and then for the main Headlock books we did 60 days, which is just, I mean, it's grueling. I mean, I usually gain somewhere between 10 and 15 pounds in stress weight. So it's I always say it's like the sort of the best and the worst thing I've ever done, because we wouldn't exist. I mean, at the level we exist at without Kickstarter, but I mean, you go through, put you through the ringer.
It really sounds like it. Now, this may be I don't want to answer my own question, but just to make sure I understand, with not having shows to promote it in person, is that kind of a consequence of the pandemic, or is like kind of as a difference to the past, or like why aren't there more like shows this time around versus the previous projects?
It's a combination of things. Some of it's the wrestling landscape. Some of it is the pandemic. But I had really planned to do this a lot sooner in the year, and then, for me, I sort of liken my existence to sort of playing in the ground between two giants. So, I mean, WWE was releasing people, and just the wrestling landscape changes, and like sometimes you have a very narrow window to try to secure somebody for a story, on their no compete. So, like I had really planned to run this over the summer, but then people started getting released, and things changed, and then you're like, oh well, let's try to do this and let's try to do that, and just things just kept shifting, and I didn't feel comfortable launching it without, because I wanted to give myself the best opportunity to sort of work with some people, and and then things fell how they fell, and then finally I was just like, I got to get it done before the end of the year, because I have, unfortunately Kickstarter is my primary method of distribution. Like I don't use comic book stores. I'll sell my stuff at conventions and wrestling shows and whatever, but it just had to be done, and I needed it to be done before the end of the year. Otherwise you get a giant chunk of income, and then you don't have the ability to spend to spend it out before you have to pay taxes on it. So
right.
It's a tricky deal. So, and then I also trying to get the book out before the holiday rush, before the UPS or the postal service prices go up, which I failed to do, but it's all right. But it's just I just want to get this. I want to get this done so I can get the next thing done. We've got 2 other titles that I'd like to launch. We're working on volume 5 for Headlocked. I wrote a movie that we're adapting into a comic book. So it's a little bit crazy. You know what I mean? Like I do everything related to Headlock that's not art. You know what I mean? I do
Right,
everything but
right.
the art. So I'm basically one dude that's, selling, publishing comics out of his bedroom, and I work a full-time job on top of that. So it's exhausting.
It's, again, it certainly sounds like I commend you for that. We went a little out of order. I do want to talk, like we've been talking about Kickstarter. I want to talk about the process of working with these various people, but maybe just take a step back in a more general sense. For someone that has no idea about Headlocked and Tales from the Road, how would you describe, in this case, I'll say Tales from the Road, to someone that, again, doesn't really know much about it, but maybe potentially be interested in it? Like, what is it? What's the the purpose behind doing it, or your hope in doing it, that kind of thing?
So to explain Tales from the Road, I kind of have to explain Headlock first. So I love wrestling and comics my whole life. And just growing up, like, I would buy every wrestling comic that came out. And I mean, to me, they all just weren't great. I think as a consumer, you always know when something is being made for love or something's being made for money.
Right.
And it's one thing to license a book when wrestling's hot. And there's a WCW book and a couple of WWE iterations that just, to me as a fan, never quite hit. So I wanted to, it just became apparent to me at some point that nobody was going to make the wrestling comic that I thought, wrestling fans should have, or at least the wrestling comic that I wanted to read, and some of my other friends wanted to read. So I, took it. I put together a pitch. Scripts, business plan, and I took it to every comic book publisher I could find, and I was summarily laughed out of the room by most of them. I mean, like, literally a dude laughed in my face, like one guy. But I mean, people told me no one's ever going to read this, no one would ever buy this. Wrestling fans, do wrestling fans even read, is a thing that somebody said to me. And this is after, obviously, like, this is a few, I've known this for 10 years now, but I mean, this was after, Mick Foley's biographies are out there, these New York Times bestsellers and stuff. And these are still sort of the preconceptions you're fighting, because, comics has its own bubble, just like wrestling has a bubble. Right. And all these people are in the bubble and they don't necessarily see out of it. So I just, I worked 2 jobs for a year to pay for my first print run, to pay for my artists, to pay for, some convention tables and such. And then, I had the book made. I started going out, just hitting shows. I would sell out on my backpack at wrestling shows, through message boards and stuff. And, we just sort of grew. And then once Kickstarter became a thing, you're sort of able to bypass the market and bypass the gatekeepers. And, we had a great response to it. And that enabled us to, to make more books. And then so Headlocked was a big success. And then as we went along, like, wrestlers who like comics would see me at shows and they would buy my books, and then, be like, oh man, this is really cool. I really like this. I mean, I think my favorite sort of, my favorite compliment I get is when wrestlers ask me if I've ever wrestled, or there's no way you never wrestled before, or whatever, just, I feel like we've really hit a strong line of authenticity. So then we started collaborating on short stories. The main Headlock story is told from one person's perspective. It's a story of a theater major who falls in love with wrestling sort of unexpectedly, and then he drops out of school, and sort of his journey through the business, like learning the craft of wrestling, but you sort of just see what he sees. So we took this opportunity to do stories and sort of flesh out some corners of the universe that you might not see. And it's also just an opportunity to collaborate with people I respect and to just tell fun stories. So some of the stories are stories that are connected to characters in Headlocked. The thing is that you don't have to read anything. You never have to read anything Headlocked wise to understand the stories from Tales from the Road. But if you do, there's a little extra layer in some of them. For instance, in this particular story, in this particular volume, the story I did with John Morrison is based off of a real life experience that he had, where he auditioned for a role to play a wrestler in a commercial, and he was the only actual wrestler there, but also he did not get the part. And we have a character in the Headlock series who sort of flamed out of Hollywood and was going back into wrestling. And so we thought we could make that sort of the moment, something similar, be like the moment that sort of, ends his sort of, where he realizes he's just never going to make it in Hollywood. So we just but a lot of them are just kind of out there. You know what I mean? Like we did a story with Gangrella about a guy that trains Bigfoot to wrestle. We did a Santo riff, like a Santo monster movie with Taya. We try to generally find a way to tie them back to reality. In our last volume, we did a story with MVP about the Punisher of shady promoters. But when you get to the end of it, it's just sort of this kid in his car with his empty pay envelope having like a little fantasy. So we're able to sort of just stretch our legs, creatively, and sort of just get into everything, any kind of genre, any kind of story. And it's some of the most fun I've had making comics, like, collaborating with people who I respect and getting to do some cool stuff.
I mean, it sounds absolutely amazing. Again, as a wrestling fan and as a comic fan, I'm looking at the lineup of talent for this run, and I'm going to read off it because it is just an amazing assembly of talent here. So we have AJ Styles, Crime Time, Danhausen, Danny Limelight, Effy, Frankie Kazarian, Jeff Cobb, you mentioned John Morrison, Matt Cardona and Brian Myers, Pentagon, Rob Van Dam, and Thunder Rosa. So that is just, as I said, an amazing group of talent, and also a very, I guess, eclectic assembly where obviously they all bring different things to the table. They're all different people, different personalities. What's it like, interacting with, working with, trying to collaborate with so many diverse people, and trying to kind of percolate that and assemble it all into one. I know it's an anthology series, but still, I imagine that can be daunting at times.
Yeah, absolutely. You want the stories to all have kind of a different feel. And they are, like, some of them are more serious and some of them are very funny and some of them are more fantasy based, and it's a little bit of everything. It's been great. I mean, wrestlers are all storytellers, whether they know it or not. They're telling stories in the ring, they're telling stories in the car, they're telling, every time I'm around a group of wrestlers, they're just, telling stories. So, I mean, it's, in most cases, the collaborations are very easy. I usually try to approach it with a couple of ideas to get things sort of headed in the right direction. And then, it's different for everybody. Like Mick Foley wrote a whole, pro story for me to adapt. And the hardest thing is that wrestlers don't always know what real estate in a comic book gives you. So, the story we did with Crime Time, which, as far as I know, is one of the last things that Shad did before he passed. Like, I got the edits like 3 days before he died. And I love that man. Like, he was an OG supporter from day one and just the best dude. Like, I love that dude so much. And, and he loves comics, but, like, when it came to, he's like, him and Jay sent me a thing. And then I look at the PDF and I'm like, no, you can't put 12 panels on a page. I'm like, have you ever read a comic book with 12 panels on a page? And it's just that, so, like, it helps to, to work out a concept and, to work together and collaborate and stuff. And that's been the fun part, is just the collaboration. I just wrapped a story with the Inspiration. That's the longest story that we've done. It's sort of a body horror story that's got a little Nightmare on Elm Street kind of feel to it, but it's 20 pages. And it's, they sort of pushed it in a direction that I wouldn't have taken it. And then that ended up being the thing that made the story. Like, one of them had suggested, a villain. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. And I don't know how we make that work. And then I thought about it a little and I was like, well, what if we did it this way? And then we're like, oh yeah, that's the thing. And then it just became such a cool story. And, so that's my favorite thing. Some of these guys I've known, I've known Thunder Rosa for years. She was at my Comic-Con booth one year when Lucha Underground first started. And, like, it always amazed me how many young girls gravitated to her that had no idea about wrestling or Lucha Underground or anything that she did. Like, she just looks like a superhero. And so I've always been one of her biggest fans for the longest time. And she's a great human on top of that. And so, the opportunity came up to collab, and I know she's a big X-Men fan. So, thinking about it, and I'm like, she just opened Mission Pro, and it's, it's all it's all women and whatever. And, like, ultimately, when you think about it in an X-Men way, she's kind of Magneto. And
Interesting. Yeah.
And that's, but a good Magneto, you know what I mean? Like, and so, we built a story sort of around that. And so it's it's super fun, and all the stories are different and fun, and some are serious, and they'll have, I don't know, they're all really good, and I'm really proud of the collection. I'm really proud of all the stories that we've put together. By June, I'll probably have enough for volume 4, and this is volume 2. So,
Wow,
I mean, we're really plugging away.
that's fantastic. You mentioned, I guess I'll circle back to you mentioned the crime time one about them not necessarily knowing so much about the real estate in the comic, and so I guess I'm curious about kind of that divide of like people that have stories to tell but maybe not be so familiar with comics, and vice versa. Like, do you find is it easy? I would imagine it's probably easier for people that may have more of a familiarity with comics, but do you think it's is it like too much of an obstacle if someone's not necessarily a comic fan? Like, does someone have to be a comic fan or familiar with comics to really be easier to work with in this sense, or can kind of work with anybody as long as they've got a interesting enough story?
Oh yeah, no, I'll work with anybody as long as the chemistry's there. There've been some people that I've tried to sort of, work with, and it just, sometimes things just don't click, and it's not, anybody's fault or whatever. You just don't have the sort of creative chemistry. And, I want everybody that's a part of the stuff that we do to be excited about it, to want to be there. You know what I mean? Like, so it's as much, I can take as much, sometimes it's just sitting down with somebody at a show or at a bar or a restaurant, kicking around ideas. We hit a concept, we work out the story beats. I'll write it, I send it to them. They'll give me the edits, send it back, and we hash it out, and then we get to a place that we're comfortable with, and then, and then it comes out. Some of them are super easy. The story I did with Shane Helms, he was literally sitting in a waiting room waiting for an MRI on his neck, not knowing if his career was going to be over. And he called me up, and, we talked it out, and then I had a story like probably written in 10 minutes. Like, it was so fast. And then, and it's one of my favorite stories, and it's super powerful. And it's even more powerful, I think, if you know what he was going through at the time that we conceived it. So, it's fun, and it's different. Like I said, it's a little bit of a different process for everybody, but it's super rewarding.
I mentioned this like all-star group of talent here, and just, but again, with that kind of eclectic assembly, like, how do you go about finding these people? Granted, not specifically like, obviously if you see them at a wrestling show, or if you have known them in the past anyway, but like, what do you kind of look for in some of the wrestlers that you do wind up working with? Like, what kind of stands out to you? What's kind of your not recruiting process, but kind of your scouting process, I guess, in that sense?
I think you just look for people that are creative. And I like people that, because we made our own brand, you know what I mean? Like, we sort of, between, I'm a double independent. Like, you've got, I'm not a Marvel or DC comic, I'm not a superhero comic, and I'm not, affiliated with any wrestling promotion. So, like, I'm in the middle of these two fields that are sort of dominated by giants. And, so, but we made our own place. And so I have the utmost respect for people that sort of make their own place. Like a guy like Matt Cardona has done so much and been given so little. They brought him in as an Edge impersonator, and then, he basically built the WWE's YouTube channel, and then, he got himself over, and then, they just didn't seem like they appreciated it. And then he got himself over again with the podcast, and he's gotten himself over again in GCW. And I have so much respect for guys like that. Effy is, Effy, like the first, like, I'd known Effy for a long time. And then, like, it was one day, like, he had merch, and it was a prayer candle. And I was like, oh man, like, people, Danhausen is like that, these guys that just, I knew him pre-makeup, so, like, to see these guys sort of to make it, like, those are the people I look for. MVP sold his gimmick to WWE, which I don't think anybody's ever done. Samoa Joe sort of resisted the sort of pressure to be a typical Samoan wrestler, and became a star on his own. Same with Mustafa Ali, and like, I love people like that are creative. Like, you can just kind of get a feel, and sometimes you don't. Like, there's I had a guy that I tried to collaborate with recently who is a fantastic wrestler that I thought we would really click, and it just didn't work out. You know what I mean? Like, just wasn't, sometimes people are just sort of, very, narrow in their own focus, and it just, things happen. So it's, but generally, you know what I mean? Like, I look for the guys that sort of, build their own things. You know what I mean? Like what Thunder Rosa is doing right now is amazing to me. You know what I mean? And those are also the people I want to spotlight. I mean, everybody knows what she's done in AEW, but I mean, probably not as many people know what she's doing with Mission Pro, which I think is really cool. So, if I can put a spotlight on that sort of thing, and they can put a spotlight on me, it's a little, the rising tide raises all ships kind of deal.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Thunder Rosa. I really like the Magneto comparison. And you also mentioned Danhausen a minute ago. And that leads me to asking, like, I mean, to me, there's always been, or as to me as a fan of both, you mentioned both fields, there's such an inherent connection and just overlap and similarity between the two. It's like comics and wrestling, there is almost, they go together so well. In both senses, where you can have wrestling stories and comics, and then you see a lot of wrestling characters feel like comic characters come to life. In that regard, I think of a guy like Danhausen and some others as well. You mentioned again Thunder Rosa and the Magneto comparison. What are some of the most comic book like characters in wrestling today? And kind of maybe as a second part of that, like what maybe some of the people that you're working with, or if not, like what do you want to be working with them for that very reason?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a character guy when it comes to wrestling. Like, my favorite thing to watch, like, I know this probably isn't a super popular opinion, but like, I love the new NXT. And I mean, my favorite thing is to watch people sort of find their voice as a character. I mean, NXT is so weird now, where they put all these new people on TV, and they're all sort of workshopping their characters in real time. And I kind of love that, watching people figure it out. I love watching a guy go from the indies and find that minute when everything clicks for them, and they sort of develop that confidence, and they're not thinking anymore, and they're just being. Like, that to me is fascinating. So like, those are the things that I love watching, that I love seeing in wrestling. So I'm always sort of focused on that type of stuff, in terms of what I enjoy. And I do think, to a certain extent, I think wrestling has lost a little bit, I mean, character wise. Like, characters are what brought me. George the Animal Steel is what made me a wrestling fan. And I think that, I was very conscious of, as a sort of independent brand, like, what gets people to pay attention to you, And for me, like, my entry into wrestling was George the Animal Steel. And my entry into comics was the spinner racks at the grocery store that don't exist anymore. And I think you forget about, people always talk about the casual fan and how do you attract them. But I think, like, when people are flipping channels or scrolling through or whatever, like, that you have to be able to know what a character's about, like, instantly. You know what I mean? Like, when you see Bray Wyatt, like, you know what Bray Wyatt is. When you see Steve Austin, you immediately know what he is. But sometimes, you know what I mean? If you're just a first name, last name, boots and tights striker, like, I don't necessarily know how that, I mean, it's, you can be a great wrestler, but I don't necessarily know how that gets people to stop. You know what I mean? It's a thing that, you know what I mean? You can still win people over that are already watching, but in terms of how do you get people to sort of stop flipping the channel? And to me, like, big, bold, bright characters are the way to do it. Like, Orange Cassidy to me is amazing, and I've known him forever. Like, pre-Orange Cassidy, like 2009, I think we did a Comic-Con together in Philadelphia when he's with Shikara. And, so it's really cool to find people who do, like, sort of different out of the box things, and they're not just sort of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, sort of cosplaying as their favorite wrestler growing up, because that drives me crazy too. Like, I feel like we've gotten too far into the weeds with that, some of that stuff, in terms of, I think it's one thing to honor your favorite wrestler, but it's another thing to borrow parts of their gimmick that don't necessarily fit your character. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I think Orange Cassidy definitely has a comic book feel to him, and obviously Danhausen, and definitely has a comic book feel to him. Nikki, I think, is still kind of, to me, Nikki's still like working out her gimmick, and obviously, Shane Helms is like one of my best friends. So like he, like I have a lot of love for the superhero gimmick, and I think she's got potential there. I don't think she's there yet, but I think it's, I mean, I think it's the type of thing that, again, that's the thing that makes people stop and look and be like, whoa, this is sort of unique look, or somebody that's doing something that nobody else has ever done or nobody else has ever seen. And so those things are, I don't know, those are the things that I guess are fascinating to me, and that make me watch.
I'm very much the same way. I'm always drawn to the characters, and again, being a comic book fan in both ways. Like I like the characters in comic books, and I like the characters on the wrestling program. So I'm very much in alignment there. But you mentioned so maybe sometimes seeing these stories kind of in wrestling, or these characters in wrestling, and usually like you see a character kind of have a story. We saw Nikki kind of become this hero. We saw that kind of unfold. You mentioned that tonight. We're still kind of seeing that continue to progress here. But maybe in a more general sense, we've been talking about obviously Tales from the Road. It's this anthology of these kind of separate stories, but to me, there's something interesting about thinking about other possibilities for comics and wrestling in a general sense. So I was wanting to ask, do you have any interest in like potentially doing more of a biographical kind of thing for any one wrestler, of like kind of trying to tell their like real story, or maybe a specific story that we as like a recreation of something that was, you mentioned, just for example, Steve Austin, maybe like doing a biography of his rise to fame in a comic book, something to that effect, just kind of exploring other possibilities within the genre like that.
So yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things I got going on. I'm trying to I'm developing a series with Gangrel that we did the first miniseries a short story in the last Tales from the Road, that we'd like to sort of spin out into a regular series about a guy who trains Bigfoot to wrestle in the Pacific Northwest in the 80s. And everybody thinks it's a gimmick, but it's really Bigfoot. And then, we open the story with Bigfoot in rehab doing yoga. So, I mean, it's a wild type story. And then in this particular volume, we have a story that we did with Cardona and Myers that's basically Toy Story with wrestling action figures. And I've got so many ideas for that. And we talked about doing more, maybe doing something like quarterly almost around some big conventions and such. I think that bios are tricky. I would definitely like, and it's funny, I'm somewhat biased because obviously Jerry Lawler does all the covers to my comic books. But to me, like, I would be interested in doing a bio of Jerry just because he's had such a long career, and I don't think he'll ever get the credit for everything that he's done for wrestling creatively. Like, to me, Jerry is basically every concept that we attribute to almost modern sports entertainment came through Memphis. I mean, they to me, they're the Simpsons of wrestling. Like, ECW was essentially basically ripped from Memphis. Everybody knows the Shawn Michaels Playgirl thing with the belt, but like Jerry did that first. I mean, he had celebrities. He had Adam West on Memphis as Batman. He fought monsters. He fought Dr. Frank was a Dr. Frankenstein. You know what I mean? Like, all the concepts that you sort of attribute to modern sports entertainment, to me, originated in Memphis. And I mean, obviously the Andy Kaufman thing is one of the most iconic things in not just wrestling, but in television. And like, he did everything first. And there's so many people who just know him as like the puppies guy or as an announcer. And that to me is, is somewhat frustrating. I think if you can, if you can show a thing that people don't necessarily see, because obviously people, certain people control history. You know what I mean? Like, I think this weekend that, there was a lot of talk that this might be the last Shimmer show, but I mean, where would we be without Dave Prazak? You know what I mean? Like, I mean, and there's a guy, we all know that, Stephanie McMahon invented women's wrestling apparently, but like, whatever. And it's fine. I understand like scale and whatever, but I mean, Dave Prazak did so much for so many people. And, there's a name that, in theory, if people don't keep it alive, could just sort of disappear into the annals of history. And so like, those are the types of things that would probably interest me. I guess if I wanted to tell a story, like, I don't think I need to rehash Austin 316 with, You know what I mean? Because I mean, a lot of these guys have written biographies and they've told their stories and such. And I don't necessarily need to rehash that stuff. I mean, it's an easy way to make money, but that's not what I want to do. I mean, I'd kill myself literally to make all these books. And I just want to do, I want to do fun and cool stuff. I don't ever want people to be like, oh, this dude's hacking this out for $1, because that's how I felt as a kid. And I don't ever want to put somebody through that. If that means it's a harder path, it's a harder path. But I do think that there are very interesting stories to be told sort of between the lines, I guess, in terms of, you know, unsung credit for, you know, creatives and stuff like that I think might be interesting. And it might be something I explore.
More again, even just looking at the previews and the looking at the Kickstarter page for Tales from the Road, it really does look like a lot of the stories are being told in these collections. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing it, you know, come to fruition here. And as you mentioned, all these kind of stories in the pipeline as well. The stories still to come. So very much looking forward to that, because it's, again, a really cool mashup of wrestling and comics. So that being said, I think you punctuated it in a very fitting way. So for people who want to check out the Kickstarter or just the more information about Headlocked and Tales from the Road in general, do you want to plug the various platforms where they can do so?
Yeah, all of the social media is Headlocked Comic. It's one word. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. I feel like I'm a little too old for TikTok. We'll see how it goes. But it's you know, it's all me. I run everything. So, you know, you'd be interacting with me if you got questions. I try to help people that are interested in breaking into comics, since I made just about every mistake possible. Obviously, and you know, I got links to the Kickstarter in there, or you can go to Kickstarter.com and search for Tales from the Road Volume 2. We've got a few days left to go. Like I said, the backers really matter. You know what I mean? Like, we've hit our financial goal, so like I don't need people to come in for big money. I mean, if you want to, listen, I ain't gonna turn it down. I mean, every bit helps, honestly, because I've got so many things I want to make, so many stories in the pipeline. So, I mean, I literally won't see a dime of any of this money. Like I said, I work a full-time job. My lights are on, my bills are paid. So every dollar goes back into the machine. It just goes to artists. It goes to my printer. It goes to, you know, the post office or whatever. But like, there's so many stories we have left to tell. And there's so many stories I want to tell, that, you know, it just, everything goes back into the machine. So every bit helps.
And again, very much looking forward to seeing those stories being told, hopefully, again, in this volume and beyond. So that being said, Michael, I thank you so much for your time today. And I wish you the very best in your, you know, continuing adventures with Headlocked and Tales from the Road.
Thanks so much, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.